And please do let me know when there's 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 5 minutes to go, and I'll round off as needed. So thanks so much for hosting me today. Apologies for being slightly late. There was a slight time zone confusion. But what I'm really excited to talk to you about today is my forthcoming book, which is, as was just mentioned, Food, Justice and Animals, Feeding the World Respectfully. And that'll be out early next year with Oxford University Press. Now, this is a book that in many ways draws more strongly upon political philosophy and animal rights, but philosophy of food and broader food ethics questions never far from my mind, because this is fundamentally a book about food. And it's a book about what the future food system of a society, what the food system of a society that respected animal rights would look like. What kind of future food system should those who advocate animal rights, myself included, call for? An obvious answer would be that we should call for a plant-based food system, a vegan food system. But I want to push back against that. And I want to suggest that there are actually reasons that we should allow and indeed support a non-plant-based food system, a food system with animal products within it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to briefly introduce the book as a whole, and then I'm going to zoom in on a particular chapter so we can get to something a little bit more detailed and explore some fun little philosophical arguments. So as a starting question, what's wrong with a plant-based food system? That's what an animal rights theorist would typically be thought to be endorsing, a plant-based food system. And that's been the assumption from abolitionist animal rights theory, which is was a mainstream animal rights theory for a number of years, and indeed of new, what we might call zoopolitical approaches to animal rights, which draw upon political philosophy and imagine a future society in which humans and animals live together within one political system. But still, the food system that this kind of picture envisages, although animals remain, the food system that is envisaged is generally thought to be, or generally assumed to be, a vegan food system, a plant-based food system. There are two major intellectual influences that I take in this book. The first is liberal theory. The second, as you might guess, is animal rights theory. And I think from both of these perspectives, there are reasons that we should be quite concerned about a plant-based food system. This slide here, by the way, is kind of chapter 1 of the book that justifies the suggestion that we should be looking beyond veganism, looking beyond plant-based food systems. I'm going to introduce this briefly, but I think it will provide a really important background to the more detailed work that I'm going to look at over the bulk of the presentation. So from liberal theory, we can recognise a concern about diverse conceptions of the good. Central to liberalism, as I understand it, is the recognition that people value a variety of different things. People have a very different idea of what it means to live a good life. And that needs to be recognised and that needs to be respected, okay? You like some things, I like some things. You have your religion, I have my religion. You have your sexual interests, I have my sexual interests. In a liberal society, we live side by side in mutual toleration. Now, these diverse conceptions of good don't mean that we can violate rights, and that doesn't mean that we can violate animal rights, because I see animal rights as very much the same kind of thing as human rights. Okay, that's part of the point of talking about animal rights in political philosophy. These are things that need to be protected as a matter of justice. Nonetheless, this does give us a reason to say, well, given that lots of people value access to animal-based foods, foodies, people who work with food, people for whom food is culturally or religiously significant, and so on. Given that people have these values, it is a regrettable thing if we have to rule out all elements of the food system. We can also ask questions about food justice as traditionally understood, questions about people's access to food, food security issues, questions about people's control over foodways, questions about culturally appropriate food. A challenge that is often raised against veganism or against the prospect of a plant-based food system is that this will struggle to deal with certain food justice issues. It will either not remedy them or it might even exacerbate them. So those are the kinds of concerns from a liberal direction that I raise or I acknowledge about a plant-based food system. But there are also concerns from an animal rights direction, and that might sound bizarre. The first is a new literature, which some of you may be familiar with and which I've contributed to, called New Omnivorism. That's a term I borrow ultimately from Andy Lamy, philosopher Andy Lamy. New Omnivorism is a set of arguments against veganism, against plant-based eating that say that, well, actually, there are certain forms of animal-based production methods that are less harmful to animals than plant-based production methods. Again, I'm just running over this very quickly to give you some background, but in a sentence, when a combine harvester goes over a field, animals are killed. And at least in principle, fewer animals might be killed if we take an animal-based production method. And another concern is this old worry about abolitionist animal rights theory, which is, well, where are the animals going? Okay. It seems like even if we take a zoopolitical approach like Sue Donaldson and Will Kimlickers and say, right, we're going to liberate animals and find a place for them in our society, it's just not clear what place that is. From an animal rights perspective, we might worry about a plant-based food system, thus, because it seems to be a food system, it seems to be a society without many, many animals, without a home for many, many animals. And it's at least feasible that we could imagine a non-plant-based food system which respected animal rights and found a home for animals. So that's the justification for an alternative vision, which I want to try and develop, and I do develop over the course of the book. And recall that I'm just giving you a flavour of the book as a whole before we dip into some slightly more sophisticated arguments as I zoom in on a particular chapter. So what kind of alternative am I envisaging? Well, I think that if we're animal rights theorists, we support rights for sentient beings, those beings who have the capacity to feel pleasure and pain, roughly. I mean, we can argue about the precise definition of sentience, but that leaves open the possibility of farming and eating non-sentient animals. Oysters are a go-to example for me. And we can also ask questions about invertebrates who are probably non-sentient. Okay, that's chapter 2. Chapter 3 concerns plant-based meat, and that's what I'm going to talk about in more detail, so I'll come back to that in a second. Chapters 4 and 5 address cellular agriculture. Now, many of you may have heard of cultivated meat or in vitro meat. Some of you will also be familiar with the technological developments that allow us to produce milk and eggs via what's been called precision fermentation. Okay. Now, these raise a host of different ethical issues, which is precisely why they're worth exploring at some length over the book. And then finally, I think there might be room for a vision of farming animals without slaughterhouses. I think that's actually necessary for cellular agriculture, because to get the system going, we need to add cells. We need cells to start the process of producing cultivated meat. But I also think there's room for the production of eggs and milk, certainly eggs, potentially milk, if we adopt a vision of animal workers and protect animals with the rights of labourers. Now, this is all super, super brief, right? This is all super brief. I'm just giving you a very quick flavour of the overarching direction of the book. But I hope you can see why I'm doing what I'm doing and where I'm kind of going. So the conclusion I reach in the book is that we should explore the possibility of non-vegan food systems. Insofar as they could be compatible with animal rights, they should be permitted. And insofar as they might be able to overcome the problems with the plant-based food system that I've already identified, they should be endorsed. Now, you might say, well, what does permitted mean? What does endorsed mean? Good questions that I explore towards the end of the book. The quick caveat I want to provide is that this is a proposal of what political philosophers call ideal theory. And what that means is I'm designing a food system of the future. I'm not necessarily making any claims about what we should be endorsing now. So nothing I say, for example, suggests that we should not be vegan here and now. Nothing I say suggests that people who are engaging in vegan activism are making a mistake. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't, but we need to do more work than just identify this future that I'm proposing. So there's a very quick overview. And what I really wanted to do for the purposes of this presentation was to zoom in on the issue of plant-based meat. And the reason I've chosen plant-based meat in particular as something to zoom in on are twofold. Number one, threefold. Number one, this is a nice self-contained little chapter. Number two, this isn't something that's been explored to a great extent. And number three, I think there are some considerations here that might be great fun for philosophers of food to get their teeth into, rather than going deep into animal rights theory, which is what I'm doing in some other parts of the book. So the background to this chapter on plant-based meat is the claims I've already made about the problems with plant-based or vegan food systems. The suggestion I've made is that it would be great if we could identify ways that we could have meat while also respecting animal rights. Ways that, to use a phrase I've used a lot when talking about this book, ways that we could have our cow and eat her too. Okay? Ways that we can have animal rights and the food that we value. So given that background, it might seem like a wonderful thing that we can develop plant-based meat, and we could have a system that uses plant-based meat in a big way. If you're wondering what exactly I mean by plant-based meat, I'll get to that in a second. But what I spend most of the chapter doing is delving into the literature around plant-based meat, popular press, scientific press, philosophical work, activist conversations. There are two sets of concerns that people have about this technology, about this possibility as part of a future food system, or as something we should be championing as part of a future food system. The first is the idea that replicating meat, which is what plant-based does, is somehow disrespectful to animals. And the second is the idea that plant-based meat is, for some reason, bad food. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through a range of different ways that these two arguments might be made and try and identify some worries about them, some reasons to reject them. And ultimately, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to say, given that we have good reasons to champion the presence of meat when it is not violating animal rights, if I can show that these objections to plant-based meat are ones that can be overcome, we should be championing plant-based meat as part of a future food system, even if, as I do, we think that animals have rights. Okay, first thing I'll do is I'll say a little bit about what plant-based meat is. It's easiest to say what it isn't. I'm not here talking about traditional plant-based sources of protein like tofu or tempeh or seitan or beans, or not just those things. Those things can go into making plant-based meat, but they are not plant-based meat on their own. I'm not talking about simple veggie burgers either, or, veggie sausages. These have existed for a lot of years. Plant-based meat, as I now understand it, or as we now use the term, is something a little bit newer. And I'm certainly not talking about cultivated meat or other products of cellular agriculture, which use different kind of technological routes. Although the lines blur at the edges, right? So very famously, the Impossible Burger, for example, uses the products of precision fermentation, which is a form of cellular agriculture, to produce heme, which is a chemical previously thought only to be found in mammal blood. So what is plant-based meat? Well, basically, it's using plants to replicate as closely as possible the tastes, textures, culinary properties of meat, so that people can have meat or have something very, very close to meat without the need for animals to be harmed. Now, some of you might say, well, hold on, this isn't really meat in any sensible sense of the term. And I think that's an interesting claim. Okay, I think it's actually an open question, because we could have different conceptions of the metaphysics of meat. So we might have a historical conception of the metaphysics of meat that says something like, well, in order for something to be meat, it needs to have a particular relationship with an animal's body. On those grounds, plant-based meat probably isn't meat. We could have a material conception of meat that says, well, if we start chemically analyzing this food, we're able to tell whether it's meat or not. Again, on that picture, plant-based meat probably isn't meat. Interestingly enough, cultivated meat would probably be meat, but I'm not talking about cultivated meat right now. But on a culinary conception of meat, we would say in order to understand whether something's meat, we need to ask a chef. We need to look at how we cook it, how we prepare it, how we serve it, how it tastes, what its textures are like. And on those grounds, plant-based meat is, or at least could be, meat. Now, I don't necessarily have a horse in this race. I think the question is an interesting one, regardless of whether this is actually meat or not. But I do think that people who say that there's no way this is meat and plant-based meat is a contradiction in terms might be being a little bit quick. So that's what I'm talking about. Like I say, I'm not going to pin all my hopes on plant-based meat actually being meat. I think the ethical questions at stake about whether this is something we want in our food system are good ones nonetheless. So let me turn to the objections that I've identified to this technology, to this product. On the left here, we have someone from Vegetarian Butcher, which is a company that produces plant-based meat. I'm intrigued by this imagery, and we'll come back to it a little bit later. I actually really personally like it, the way that they tie up this kind of butcher imagery with plant-based eating. Some people might be concerned for reasons I'll explain later. Okay, so first worry is that plant-based meat might send mixed messages. The worry is that producing or eating or endorsing plant-based meat says or fails to send the proper, unequivocal message that slaughter-based meat, or what you might call conventional or traditional meat, is something that needs to be rejected. It muddies the water. It confuses what should be our central message about future food systems. Now, I can see that it is minimally plausible it might take a slightly naive view about the influence we can have on those around us. But nonetheless, it is minimally plausible that me eating a rights-respecting meat product, a plant-based meat product, could lead to those around me, my friends, my colleagues, my family, my neighbours, to think, well, Josh respects animal rights, Josh is a vegan, I see him eating these things, I must be all right to eat meat. I can understand that something like that might happen. But in response, I think that that's quite a questionable reason to use the coercive power of the state to prevent this stuff being made. And that's ultimately what I'm talking about here. I'm interested in what the state interaction with these products should be, rather than questions about individual diet. It seems quite a stretch to say that I should be prevented from doing something that is, qua hypothesis, rights respecting, simply because others might mistake what's going on or might not be fully aware of what's going on. And I think it's also worth stressing that in the kind of future society I'm envisaging, there wouldn't be mixed messages sent, okay? And I'd like to explain that point with reference to a really wonderful idea I came across in Jewish ethics. And I don't know much about Jewish ethics, so with apologies to those who do, but it's called Marit Ayin, okay? And the idea of Marit Ayin is that even if something is otherwise permissible, if it looks like it's impermissible, you shouldn't do it. Really interesting kind of ethical principle. But I think it would be confused to say, well, okay, let me put it like this. I think anyone in this room would be hard-pressed to identify at a glance the difference between panda meat and beef. Nonetheless, you might think it is permissible to eat beef, but not pandas. So you might think, well, then you've got a Marit Ayin argument against eating beef because it looks like you're eating panda. That seems to be confused to me, right? Because I don't think anybody would reasonably look at someone eating a beef burger in London or in Rome or in Paris and say, they're eating panda, or even they look like they're eating panda, just because there wouldn't be any panda meat available in these towns. Equally, in the animal rights respecting state, I'm imagining there wouldn't be any chance for confusion because there wouldn't be slaughter-based meat available. I do think these concerns about mixed messages might be an argument against me publishing this book. Or it might be an argument against me making these arguments in this kind of setting. I take those ideas quite seriously, and I do grapple with them. I'll just leave it at that. Okay, another concern, again on the idea of disrespect towards animals that we might have about plant-based meat, comes from Susan M. Turner in a very interesting article in the Animal Ethics Journal Between the Species, published in, I think, 2005. She says, when we produce plant-based meat, she shouldn't use that term, but she's talking about the same product. When we produce plant-based meat, we are participating in a non-artistic representation of non-human animals as mere resources, and this in turn violates animals' rights. If non-human animals have the same basic rights as human ones do, then all non-human animals have a basic right to autonomy, and so not to be represented as a mere resource. I think this is an interesting challenge, but I think it goes wrong for a couple of reasons. First of all, I think Turner has a very simplistic account of animal rights theory. So she assumes that animals have the same rights as humans. And I would say, well, no, we need to think about what's actually in animals' interests. She also assumes that this right to autonomy translates into a right not to be represented as a mere resource. And I think she needs more argument there. That links to my second concern about this argument. And that's that, quite rightly, we already allow and support lots of representation of human body parts. And we don't think that that represents humans as a mere resource and thus violates human autonomy rights. We don't think that human rights are violated by the simple fact that, as the picture suggests, we create glass eyes. We don't think human rights are violated by the fact that we replicate human hair for wigs or human limbs for prosthetics, or the fact that I have a cap on my teeth, right? It's not actually a tooth, it just looks like a tooth. We don't think that this kind of representation entails a violation of human rights. So it's not clear to me why would we think that representing, creating facsimiles or creating imitations of animal flesh would necessarily violate their rights. That argument to me seems to be a bit of a non-starter, or at least it needs to go back to basics in order to reach the conclusion it needs to. I think it's a much harder argument to make than Turner makes out. Now, a more mainstream worry, a more mainstream worry within vegan circles comes from vegan social theory or vegan cultural theory. Many of you will be familiar with Carol J. Adams' work, Sexual Politics of Meat, and the various ideas that are emerged around that. The worry is something like this. Meat is central to our culture and linked to oppressive attitudes. And what we should be doing is challenging meat, not trying to come up with new ways to create it, even if those ways are more respectful to animals. And that's the reason we should reject plant-based meat. And I've seen a few people kind of nod towards this argument, even if they haven't made it in the kind of analytical terms I'm inclined to do. Now, I'm happy to accept, for the sake of argument if necessary, the kind of cultural critique that links meat eating to the oppression of animals, to the oppression of women, to the oppression of non-white people, to the oppression of disabled people, and so forth. I don't want to engage in the kind of cultural critique back and forth. So I'm happy to accept that. But I do think that there are some serious limitations to this argument as applied to plant-based meat and as a reason to reject plant-based meat. The first, and this is a recurring feature of my book, despite my own animal rights and vegan commitments, we shouldn't forget meat's positive associations. Meat is associated with prosperity. Meat is associated with happy memories of childhood, happy cultural attachments. Okay, meat is associated with all kinds of positive things, not just with, say, the oppression of women. So there's going to be potentially a balancing act there. But the second thing, and perhaps a more important thing, is that cultural associations can change and evolve. Yes, meat might currently be tied up with the oppression of women, but that's not to say that it would be in years to come. And I think we might all be familiar with the ways that associations of food can change, but just an example from my own cultural background. My grandparents during the Second World War ate whale meat. Okay, that was part of their diet during the war. I've never eaten whale meat, and I've never knowingly been in the presence of whale meat. This just doesn't even register as food to me, right? In the space of a couple of generations, something that was eaten every day or nearly every day has become completely off the table, right? If our associations about what literally food is can change so drastically, of course the associations of these foods can change as well. You know, my parents' generation, certain desserts that were the height of extravagance to them just look tacky to me. And what's really interesting is, and I don't rest my argument on this in any way because this is just an appeal to authority, but what's interesting is that Adams, when she's addressed these questions, actually seems to be on my side of the debate rather than the anti-plant-based meat side. So talking about the possibility of having, say, a Beyond Burger or an Impossible Burger with a picture of a cow on the cover, on the packaging, she says that picture may bespeak a presence rather than absence. It may be a representation of those bodies allowed to live. Those of you familiar with Adam's work will recognize this whole talk of presence and absence, because she talks about animals as the absent reference when we are talking about meat. What this means is plant-based meat is already doing the good work of reversing meat's negative associations, or so it seems. Okay. Let's move to a slightly different argument that, again, is concerned about the way that plant-based meat might frame meat as food. I'll tell you why that picture's there in a second. The worry is that it might be unvirtuous to replicate a human skin lampshade. We would be horrified if someone was saying, well, can we create something that is just like a human skin lampshade? Because I really like how human skin lampshades look. And there's a clear analogy here with plant-based meat. Why this picture? Why human skin lampshade? Well, I borrow this from Bob Fisher and Berke Ozturk, who have a great paper in the Journal of Applied Philosophy called Facsimiles of Flesh. And they are talking about the serial killer Ed Gein, who was an inspiration for the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. He was a serial killer who created grotesque items out of human body parts. What if a detective had gone into the house and thought, well, that lampshade's really wonderful. I don't want to skin any humans, of course, but I still want a lampshade like it. And so they created plant-based human skin. We'd be horrified. And for the same reason, suggest Ozturk and Fisher, we should be very worried about plant-based meat. Now, few responses. The first is, I think our intuitions might be going wrong in this case because we were horrified at the thought of someone skinning a human. I actually have some sympathy for the idea that it's okay to be macabre. You know, if someone really wants something that looks like a human skin lampshade, that might be a bit grotesque for my tastes and your tastes. Well, I don't know you, maybe it's not. But in a liberal society, we have to recognize that some people have weird interests, weird tastes. I think there's something to be said for that. So maybe our initial intuitions here lead us in the wrong direction. Alternatively, even if Fisher and Ozturk are correct that this is unvirtuous, we might say, well, that's all well and good, but moral disagreement has to be respected in a liberal state. That doesn't seem to be a good reason to ban these products for the state to get involved. But then more fundamentally, I think that there might be important disanalogies between the detective and the meat eater. I think that the detective who sees the human skin lampshade is perhaps analogous to someone who goes into a slaughterhouse, sees a cow being strung up and killed in the most brutal way, screaming and bleeding out, and then says, oh, that looks great. I really want some of that. That seems to be very problematic. That seems to suggest a very odd relationship with this suffering. On the other hand, I think the people who want plant-based meat or value plant-based meat might have much more benign associations with meat. There's a big difference between going into the slaughterhouse, as just described, and saying, oh, wow, those plant-based prawns look just like those prawns I had in a paella when I was a kid on holiday in Spain. Trying to recreate that childhood memory, trying to recreate that valued dish is a bit different than trying to recreate something that for you or for anyone has always only been violence, has always only been grotesque. And I think if we're taking the virtue line, which is what Ozturk and Fisher do, or one of the lines they take, those kinds of motivations have to be paid attention to. I now turn to what I think is actually probably the most compelling disrespect argument. No one's quite made it, as far as I can see, but I tried to construct it as best I could and realised that actually this argument has some legs. Again, I'll explain why the picture in a second. The worry is that plant-based meat offers a kind of celebration of a harmful practice or a harmful tradition. The harmful practice of meat eating, the harmful tradition of killing animals. And that is a disrespectful thing. That disrespects those who were killed by that tradition. An analogy that I drew, now, some of you might have realised I could draw a lot of analogies here that might be problematic or questionable in a number of ways. So that's why this is a slightly odd analogy. But the analogy I've drawn is to think of an English village or a Scottish village that has a local folk tradition, lots of villages do, that involves something like witch burning, lighting of bonfires, setting individuals on fire. Given the date, some of you will know that very soon in the UK we do have, or in England at least, we do have a festival which involves setting a dummy on fire. That's Bonfire Night or Guy Fawkes Night. Anyways, imagine this village had this witch burning festival. And we said, well, this is deeply disrespectful because it shows deep disrespect towards those women and men and children who were killed as witches when they were innocent. All those hundreds, thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of individuals killed over the centuries. Well, we might want to say that we have duties of remembrance to these individuals killed unjustly that this kind of festival violates. Maybe. That doesn't sound like a very political claim, right? Duties of remembrance sound like moral claims that we're going to disagree about. Maybe you should engage in your duties of remembrance as you see fit, and I should engage in mine as I see fit. It's hard to imagine that the state should say, this is how we're going to engage in remembrance if it's a liberal society. We might want to adopt an indirect duty argument to push back against this witch burning festival. Okay, something like, well, there are lots of living people who care very deeply about these women and men and children who were killed as witches, and out of respect for them, we should not engage in this symbolic disrespect of the dead. Again, that seems like a very questionable, although it's in some ways a better reason because it's talking about harm to living individuals. Again, that seems like a very questionable reason for the state to get involved and say, no, you can't do this thing, or no, you've got to do it in this way. Because it seems very strange for the state to say, you can't do this thing because it's offensive to them, right? Classic liberal idea of the harm principle. Most liberal theorists don't endorse the offence principle. Mere offence is not a reason to ban a practice, usually. Or when it is, it's only in very limited circumstances, if you find Burke, for example. So the best argument I could come up with against banning the witch burning festival, and hopefully you see why I'm talking about witch burning, I'll tie it back in a second, is that it's disrespectful to those in the present, those like those killed in witch burnings, maybe contemporary Wiccan practitioners, contemporary witches, maybe elderly women who live alone, maybe those who were persecuted as witches in other parts of the world, people who, for whatever reason, are akin to those killed as witches. here's our butcher again. We might want to say something like, well, sure. So these Wiccans who are concerned about the witch burning festival, we owe some respect to them because they're really, concerned about this. They're fearful about this. They feel threatened by this. But animals don't care if we dress as butchers, right? So there's a clear disanalogy here. So maybe we can reject the witch burning festival, but not reject plant-based meats. Actually, that's not really the point. And the reason that's not really the point is seen if we look to something like anti-hate speech legislation. Some of you might know I've written a little bit about hate speech as well, and hate speech in animals. Well, and what I've written is that the arguments justifying anti-hate speech legislation actually seem to apply just as well to animals as they do to humans. And so maybe if this kind of argument that I'm pulling here, this symbolism argument, if this argument comes through, maybe dressing them as a butcher, as the vegetarian butcher does, is a kind of hate speech. It's analogous to dressing up as witchfinders, or worse, fill in the gaps. Now, you might want to say, oh, well, there's a difference between dressing up as a witchfinder, to go and scare your neighbours, and dressing up as a butcher because you're just trying to send messages about the kind of product you're creating. So there's different motives here. But that can't really solve the problem. Motives aren't a good excuse when it comes to hate speech. The pastor who says, I don't hate homosexuals, I'm just trying to protect them from being condemned to hell. They're still engaging in hate speech potentially. So even if their motives are pure, their actions can be hateful. But here's where I think we can get out of this dilemma. Symbols aren't hateful inherently. Dressing up as a butcher is not inherently hateful in the way that, language can be inherently hateful. We have the capacity, we have the chance to change meanings. And plant-based meats might be exactly the sort of thing we can use to change those meanings. So even if plant-based meat might initially seem symbolically harmful towards animals or symbolically disrespectful, we can hopefully get around that. Okay, how long do I have left, just out of interest?
You have, when did we start? Like about 10 minutes, I would say.
Okay, yeah, I'll jump through some of the next ones quite quickly then. Okay, so that's the first half of this chapter, right? That's the first set of arguments. I think I've shown that there's nothing inherently disrespectful to animals about producing or eating or consuming or endorsing plant-based meat. But maybe we still want to reject plant-based meat as bad food. And that's something that Carlo Alvaro does. And he's written this intriguing book defending raw veganism and rejecting many, many kinds of foods, including plant-based foods. So the worry might be that meat is disgusting, or it's unnecessary, or it's unhealthy, or it's intemperate to eat meat. And that's a reason to reject plant-based meat, because that too is meat or meat-like. So I've got a few responses to this. One is that, well, maybe the ideal would be a plant-based, whole foods plant-based food system, but, that's not that realistic. I don't rest on that argument because this is a work of ideal theory, not non-ideal theory. Again, I stress that there are some good things about meat. Even if Alvaro's right that meat is unnecessary and unhealthy and some meat products are disgusting, there are good things about meat as well. Associations, cultural attachments, and so forth. I don't think that these things justify the coercive power of the state. The fact that you find meat disgusting doesn't seem to be a very good reason to coercively prevent me from eating meat, right? Including plant-based meat. That seems like a very strange argument, a very deeply illiberal argument. Might be fine for virtue theory, but again, in a liberal society, we're going to recognize disagreements about what is morally right, what is disgusting, what is unnecessary, what is and is not intemperate. And I also stress that plant-based meat might be less bad than slaughter-based meat on these grounds. So, for example, I can concede that there is something disgusting about meat that is made through the suffering of animals, just as there is something disgusting about chocolate that is produced via slavery. But I don't think that that disgust translates to all meat or all chocolate. The fact that some chocolate is disgusting because of slavery does not make fair trade, well, we can ask questions about fair trade, does not make genuinely fair trade chocolate disgusting, chocolate that is produced by workers paid a fair wage. So I don't think that that set of worries gets us very far. What you see in the popular press so often when talking about plant-based meat is the fact that plant-based meat is highly processed, and this is framed as a reason to reject it. Now, actually, I think this is several different arguments. What I'm going to do for the purpose of this slide is I'm going to talk about the health aspect of that. And I want to remind you that already I've ruled out slaughter-based meat. So the comparison with slaughter-based meat I'm making here is to kind of it's to join that conversation, but really the comparison I'm making is between plant-based meat and whole foods, much the same as Loughborough. So, should we be worried about processed food? Well, processed food is extremely common. I've eaten processed foods today. I suspect many of you had. I had some breakfast cereal for breakfast this morning, and breakfast cereal is highly processed food. I had some crisps for lunch, highly processed food. We've also got to remember that highly processed food are not inherently unhealthy. And in fact, diet products are overwhelmingly highly processed foods themselves. And the literature suggests, the scientific literature suggests, that plant-based meat in health terms are roughly equal to the equivalent slaughter-based meats. So the plant-based Beyond Burgers there are have comparable health profiles to beef burgers. Even if the beef burgers might themselves be much less processed, or indeed barely processed. Yeah, I could say a lot more about processed food, and we can go into this in the Q&A if people are interested, but basically everything's processed. Processing makes inedible things edible. I grow beans in my garden. My beans go through multiple stages of processing before I can eat them. They're not actually particularly edible raw. And I would also like to point, no, I'll not say that. What I will concede is that plant-based whole foods are going to be healthier than plant-based meats, okay? That's fairly clear. But I don't think that that's a knockdown argument, because there are other values at stake than health. Health is not the only value that says what kinds of food system we want to build. There's a balancing act, okay? Access to a range of diverse flavors, access to convenient, affordable food, access to culturally important foods. These are all things that might be important when we are designing a food system. And very similar arguments could be run about the environmental impact of processed foods. Again, actually, plant-based meats are far, far better environmentally than slaughter-based meats, even if they might not be quite as good usually as vegan whole foods. And then the final concern, again, this is something that comes up in the popular press more than the academic literature, but you see this collection of challenges that plant-based meat is in some way unnatural. As I say, I think this is actually a range of different worries, but they're very hard to disentangle. Those of you in the audience familiar with the philosophy of food will already be very familiar with the response I'm going to give. We have familiar problems when it comes to talking about naturalness. What is it that makes plant-based meat unnatural? Why is it any more natural than any other food? What's the alternative, and why is that natural? Broccoli, for example, is not a plant that you find in the wild. This is selectively bred over many, many years. It's also highly processed because you can't eat it raw, or at least minimally processed. But nobody says broccoli is unnatural. So why is it that this alternative thing is natural? Look at animal farming today. This is nothing like animal farming 3 generations ago, never mind thousands of years ago. Agriculture itself is a deeply unnatural thing. And of course, the axiological question, what's so good about something being natural? So yeah, I'm not convinced by these unnaturalist lines. So where does this get us to? I'll round off. And obviously we can go into the things I've skipped over in the Q&A if people are interested. My claim here is, having dipped into this particular chapter in my book, the arguments against plant-based meat fail. And so, given the broader arguments of the book that I introduced you to at the start of the presentation, not only could or should plant-based meats be part of a future food system, even if animals have rights, but, I add, we shouldn't be too worried about them today either. But again, that steps slightly beyond the scope of the book. Now, the arguments I've made mostly extend to plant-based eggs, milk, honey, etc. Some of you will be familiar with Just Egg, formerly known as Hampton Creek, which has been in the news a lot about their egg-free mayonnaise and their other egg-free products. But I do stress that milk is not meat, eggs are not meat, honey is not meat. So there are other questions to answer about these particular foodstuffs, and I go into them in further detail elsewhere in the book. For example, I discuss cultivated milk at some length, addressing the particular ethical issues around milk, which are different to those around meat. And so just a little methodological point to finish on. When we're exploring the ethics of food, we need to be very, very specific. Okay, I hope that wasn't too chaotic. I hope you can see what I'm doing and why I'm interested in these questions. And I'm really looking forward to your comments and questions.
Thanks a lot, Josh.